So the second example that I want to give you as we continue to unpack this idea of paradigms is, and we're talking about Thomas Kuhn's theory again, is that there was the geocentric view of the universe. This was the idea that the Earth is the center. To many early astronomers, the facts seem to bear this out, seem to support it. The first man who said, no, 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 it's not the Earth that's the center, it's the sun that's the center. This is much closer to the truth, per se, than the Earth is the center, and it seemed to explain planetary rotation in a more consistent way, but as we know today, both of those ideas are completely off base. So the first theory, it's not at all factual. The Earth is not the center. The second theory, that the sun is the center, is much closer. And if there were only our solar system, would completely explain what we see. It's closer to the truth, but it's still wrong. And the third theory, today, seems true at the moment. Neither the Earth nor the sun are the center. Perhaps our current theory will give way yet to another theory in 100 years or 1,000 years. We might know more. So the point of these illustrations is that new information doesn't change a paradigm necessarily. New paradigms change paradigms. There has to be a complete new way, according to Kuhn, of seeing the same information that accounts for that basic set of information plus any new contradictory facts in a more holistic and convincing way. Oftentimes, old paradigms don't go away. They don't completely die. They coexist. You can look at probably your church, my church, or your denomination, or my denomination today, and you can see that your denomination might be filled with people who have a number of paradigms about the Bible. You might have people who are ascribing to conservative theology and liberal theology sitting side by side at the same church. You might have people who have different end times view, not might. You have people who have different end times view sitting side by side at the same church. You might have people who have very different ministry philosophies about how should the church engage the world. And so just because there is the next newer and better paradigm doesn't automatically eradicate the old paradigm. The old paradigm still finds adherents, and this is where you see conflict, this is where you see division, is as you have adherents of one paradigm discussed with another group of adherents, oftentimes these distinctions become apparent. There's a third view on understanding paradigm change, and this is called the innovation bell curve. And so we would say this is change through technological dissemination. And so if you think of a bell curve, it fits that natural curve. And so in this theory, the first 2.5% are innovators. The second, 13.5% early adopters. Then you have early majority and late majority, and you have laggards. And so in this understanding of change is directional. If we were to apply this model to church, you would say, well, think of the biggest megachurch in your city, and they're probably the biggest megachurch because they have the largest appeal to the early and late majority. Probably who they don't have, though, are the innovators. And so in terms of numerical influence, this church might be very influential. But in terms of thought influence, that group of innovators and early adopters are probably somewhere else. So this theory found its development also in the secular world, and it is used to explain things like the advent of cell phone technology. So cell phone technology went from being something that just a few people had, military applications and high-end business applications, to something that now my grandmother and your grandmother have and readily use every day. How did this happen? And so they would explain it as, well, there's this group of innovators that leads to this group of early adopters, early late majority. Once it hits there, the idea takes on. It takes root. And so this is how technology flows through a culture. I think if we were to think of some practical applications of this theory, oftentimes our plans focus on the majority, because we think about how do we have the most, the greatest return of investment for our efforts, or of our short-term trip or long-term trip for that matter. How can we get the most bang for our buck? When we should probably be asking the question, how do we reach the people who are tribal leaders, who are at the front leading edge of this flow of technology through their culture, who they are the ones who are going to be taking it to other people? This has borne itself out in many countries as missionaries came in and would focus on poor masses instead of higher educated classes. Why did they do this? They focused on the poor masses because they were easier to reach, especially as an outsider. They had greater needs. They felt ostracized by the higher, more elite classes in their own country. And so the church, the gospel, this gave them a sense of place and a sense of rootedness. I don't want to say anything bad about people coming to Christ. This is great. We always want to celebrate that. But in those same places, the gospel sometimes is finding it's having a hard time finding its root amongst the educated classes, because now it's simply perceived as, well, this is something that is of the lowly classes. And so I think it's important as we think through our outreach models, whether you're applying this in a church context or whether you're thinking evangelism models, if you're applying this in a more traditional missions context, we need to think through, how do we reach all segments of society in terms of how would we see an idea, any idea, flow through this culture? How do we see a buzzword or a catchphrase flow from one group of people through the next? And so that's one way of applying this. And the final view that we'll look at is a view that's offered by Alan Tippett. He was a missionary for a long time, and he wrote a book called People Movements in Southern Polynesia. And so if you think of Polynesia, the South Pacific Islands, they are largely animistic, and their worldview, their paradigm, is built on spiritual powers being influential in pretty much all areas of life. Whether or not your husband or wife stays faithful to you, whether or not you have a successful hunt or fishing trip, whether or not you have a good job or a good crop or healthy babies, all of this is in some way related to the spirit world. And so he promotes something called a power encounter, and this is a fairly common idea amongst missiology circles. And so his idea is that the culture is not going to change until there's this radical encounter with the spiritual power of the living God. And so they would, different missionaries have applied this in different ways. So some would go in to an area where they would, the locals might say, well, if you tick off this local spirit, then you're going to catch this illness. And so the missionaries will intentionally kind of hit that tripwire, so to speak, to show, nope, this spirit has no power over me. And so they'll kind of throw themselves in the way. You're probably thinking, as I'm talking about this, of a biblical example. A really good biblical example is Elijah and Ahab and all the prophets of Baal. And so you'll remember all these prophets are out there, and Elijah has called them out to this showdown. And they both bring out altars, and they're both going to perform sacrifices. And so the false prophets, they start offering, and this goes on for a long time, and nothing happens. And then Elijah pours water over his offering to make it even more obvious that this is God's power. And so if we take this theory and the first theory of there are these kind of moments of discomfort that lean in on a culture, this is the moment where that becomes reality, when they see fire fall and lick up the offering. And so this is something that's probably more convincing in animistic cultures. And I think, if you are from a more scientific background, you're probably less inclined to be so impressed with this sort of thing, and more inclined to argue maybe rationalistically with people from this background. But Alan Tippett, and even the author of our book, Galen Van Reenen, he's written another book on ministering animistic cultures. They talk a lot about the spiritual elements of trying to see people come to faith in these cultures, and they need to know Jesus has real, true spiritual power. And so they advocate for the power encounter. Now, If we apply that one broadly in our culture, we might look like a bunch of weirdos. But this one's probably as convincing to you as insofar as you adapt to an animistic worldview. And so this one might not be the most useful. So all of these models of change each teach us something important. They teach some important factor aspect, I think, about culture change, about paradigm change, paradigm shifts. And so as we think through this, you might be tempted to go, okay, I'm going to do this version or that version. And I would encourage you, learn what you can from each. We don't have to say, well, this one is the right paradigm for understanding paradigm change. Maybe this is just a little bit more postmodern of me, where I'm happy to pick and choose from these theories. But I also want to encourage you, we neither need to fear secular theories. I think we can learn from them, but neither do we need to bow down to them. As Christians, we do have an ally. We do have the Holy Spirit. We do have a living God who is able to circumvent and supersede normal human patterns. And I think that's something important for us to understand. I mean, I can theorize all day about how do I create some outreach program that will find the right group of innovators and all of these things. And then it winds up, I could be riding the bus or on an airplane or bump into somebody at the grocery store who, completely apart from my planning, is able to just be that very key person who's influential in getting this project done. And so God is able to circumvent this. So we don't want to take out this, in trying to learn about these secular paradigms on paradigms, we don't want to take out the spiritual element that God is still at work in what we are trying to do. These cultural change patterns do not always produce the results that we wish. And this is an important fact. We always go, well, change is going to happen and it's going to be better. Well, our paradigm is change is better. Newer is better. But if we grew up somewhere else and our paradigm were different, we would say, well, sometimes change is bad. But in reality, regardless of your paradigm, sometimes change is not for the better. Sometimes it's not towards our end. Here's a couple examples. If you look at the story of Pharaoh from Exodus, Pharaoh goes through a time period of cultural stress as Moses is pushing in and these signs and wonders from God become stronger and stronger and stronger. And it's more evident that this is more than a parlor trick, that there's something real at work. You can see his worldview crumbling. But it didn't lead to a revitalization movement. Or I guess you could say it led to a failed revitalization movement. He tried to hang on and he tried to fight and he wound up failing. His revitalization movement was not enough to save him. And so I don't think that revitalization is necessarily what God was going for in that story. But it's important to see that the expected change or the hope for change does not always come in the way that we think it comes. Early Christians were the collateral damage of the Roman revitalization movement. I've already talked about that earlier. When we lived in the Middle East, we were there during the Arab Spring, and some of the Christians in our country participated, and they were so hopeful that if we could just get rid of this dictator that we have, we'll have democracy. And they thought, well, democracy equals religious freedom, individual rights and liberties for everybody. Well, in our paradigm here in the United States, that's exactly what it means. In their paradigm, though, it's not going to mean that because democracy is still run by a majority vote. And so if you're in a majority country where everyone thinks differently from you, but a minor percent of you, chances are the new constitution that you would all write together would be more largely influenced by them than by you. And so not all change leads to what you're expecting. The evolutionary paradigm is another paradigm that has large effects even outside of evolutionary theory. This has had effects on end times theology, on eschatology. This has had effects on how we view world religions, on how we view religion itself, even from a secular standpoint. And I think even if we do speak scientifically, this paradigm has changed. This model and theory have changed a number of times over the years and will continue to change. I'm friends through ministry in Houston with a number of Chinese scientists and doctors who talk about genetics, and they talk about how they don't think They know way more than I could even regurgitate to you about how impossible they see the theory of evolution. These are not believers, mind you. These people are atheists, but they go, evolution just can't be true. Now, they've reached this crisis point. According to Kuhn's theory, will they have a bigger paradigm that understands it? And then, for us as believers, will that fit a model that we hope, or will it simply just be another variant of disbelief in God? I imagine that will probably be what it is, but it won't be the current paradigm of disbelief in God. And so we need to just be careful as we set our expectations on cultural change. I want to give you a short generalization. I'm admitting it's a generalization, but an interesting generalization that will help you see how something like Christianity, which when we see it according to our paradigm, we just get it. We say, well, A is A. Christianity is Christianity. What do you mean? What kind of Christianity? But this short statement might help you see how paradigm influences how you see the same nugget of truth that we all see today. So a friend of mine told me this. He said, Christianity started in the Middle East as a relationship. It moved to Greece, where it became a philosophy. It moved to Rome, where it became a system. It moved to Europe, where it became an art. And then it moved to the United States, where it became a business. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the full picture on how things happened, but it's intriguing just to think in these broad generalizations how each one of those places has put its special mark of understanding and interpretation on this thing that we all assume is the one thing that we know it to be. And when you hear that list, you think, well, maybe I've never thought of it as a philosophy, or maybe I've never thought of it as an art. Or maybe we're offended to think that someone from one of those backgrounds would look at our model for Christianity and call it business, because I don't wake up and think of it that way. But compared to some of these other models, I go, well, we use marketing strategies, we're tracking attendance and reach and all these kind of other metrics now that are common language for us. So your writing prompt for the discussion board is this. Now that you've heard this talk on paradigms, paradigm change, I want you to think through the paradigms in your world and answer this question. What are the changing paradigms that have shaped our current world? Now that's a huge topic, so I want you to narrow it down to something specific. Pick one of these and think of a really good example that you could highlight and express in any one of these models. It doesn't matter to me which one. But political. You could think of how we've gone from centralized power during the colonial era to a much more decentralized world today. Scientific. The science world was once the product of Christianity. The scientific revolution happened in Christian Europe, whereas today it's kind of assumed if you're a scientist, you're way beyond that antiquated belief in God. We could think of epistemology. This has gone through a number of shifts where knowledge comes from God. Okay, knowledge comes from reason. Okay, knowledge comes from science. Now we're going through a postmodern shift and maybe a post-postmodern shift. And so, who knows where the field of epistemology will go. You could think in terms of ethics. There are paradigms where ethics were absolute. There is a right and wrong. I don't think that you can assume in our world today that there is a right and wrong. Obviously, this illustrates that point where just because there's a new paradigm in town, the old paradigm doesn't necessarily die. It sometimes just coexists. And so we have people from both camps in our country today, and this is actually part of the cultural war that's ongoing. But at the basis of it is this paradigm. You could think of metaphysical things, such as life has meaning. This has kind of been the historic human position, or the more modern view, or the nihilistic view. Life is meaningless. These are two paradigms that are at opposite ends. And finally, you could think of religion. Religion is important, it's final, it's public, it's assumed. In the 1950s, you read books on church growth or planting, and it's just kind of assumed that everybody in this country woke up and thought, well, which church? The biggest decision was not, do I go to church, but which church should I go to? Which denomination should I go to? That's clearly not the world we live in today. Particularly if you're in a major urban center. That's not at all what people wake up and think about on a Sunday morning. Now they think of religion as a waste, religion as relative, there's no one right religion and the others are wrong. They think of it as private, and they think of it, it's not you can't assume that people have it. It's kind of a question as to do people have it or not, and what place it plays in their life. So I want you to take one of these things: political, scientific, epistemological, ethical, metaphysical, and religious. And don't just think in the broad scopes that I've given you, but think of some specific examples that you could use to illustrate. Here are how, here are the differences between these two paradigms, the paradigm shift that has happened. And then two, maybe illustrate it also with how do adherents to the two different paradigms, how are they speaking over each other's heads? Because a lot of times we don't understand that. What we say makes perfect sense if you're in my paradigm and in my shoes, but it probably makes no sense if you're not, and vice versa. This is why other people's arguments are often nonsensical. So what are some specifics of these examples, or a specific of this example, and then how is it that people are talking past each other as they are operating from different paradigms and worldviews?